Welcome to this video recording of Renew Northeast's Powered by Communities webinar. This is one in a series of On the Line events featuring local perspectives on electric infrastructure. Nathan Rake of Renew Northeast kicks off our program.
To provide a bit of background, electricity demand is increasing 2 to 3 times its current level in our region, as projected by ISO New England. This is being fueled by new policies and regulations with an emphasis on reaching climate and energy goals by 2050. As regulations are being finalized, Renew wants to take this time to redefine the relationship between communities and developers of clean energy projects and infrastructure. In the past year alone, more than 36 bills and dockets have been opened or addressing renewable integration, grid reliability, and affordability. Additionally, there is upwards of 6 electric transmission upgrade projects proposed that could deliver up to 10,000 additional megawatts of clean energy to New England load centers. As part of this conversation regarding community benefits and the community relationship, it really stems here in Massachusetts from the 2024 Climate Act. In November of 2024, Governor Healy signed into law sweeping climate legislation. A central component of the Climate Act directed the state's key energy agencies to reform the way energy infrastructure is sited and permitted in order to increase efficiencies and meet the Commonwealth's statutory energy goals. Another feature of the reforms included provisions to ensure that communities and other stakeholders have earlier access to project information and engagement in the siting and permitting process. The energy agencies have been meeting with stakeholders throughout the year to develop these regulations. They formally opened the rulemaking on September 12th. Looking to the future, our energy needs are going to continue to grow. We understand that there are a lot of questions and that communities and individuals have a lot on the line as we continue this clean energy transition. Renew wants to share our resources and knowledge with you. We are building a network of leaders who are passionate about making sure that local voices are heard in the development of our regional grid. If you have an opportunity, please scan the QR code and join our email list to receive alerts and updates on upcoming events. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening, Anxhela Mile.
Thank you, Nathan, and good evening, everyone. My name's Anxhela Mile, and I'm delighted to be moderating tonight's panel, Powered by Communities. I'm an environmental and clean energy staff attorney at Conservation Law Foundation, and in my role, I've seen firsthand how important it is for Massachusetts to deploy more clean energy infrastructure if we want to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. But just as important is how we do it in ways that promote energy equity and meaningfully include communities, especially environmental justice communities, in shaping this transition. With that in mind, I'm thrilled to be joined by a knowledgeable group of colleagues today. Each of our panelists brings a unique perspective on how to build a clean energy future that is both ambitious and inclusive. Now I'd like to turn to our panelists. Can you each please provide a brief introduction, telling us who you are, where you work, and a little bit about your experience? Let's start off with Natalie.
Hi all, thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you to Renew Northeast for having me. I'm Natalie Manitius. I'm a senior associate at the Clean Air Task Force. CATF is a national and international nonprofit. We work to advance policy and advocacy and research on climate and clean energy solutions. We work on a range of different clean energy technologies, but my work primarily focuses on utility scale wind, solar, and electric transmission. I focus a lot on how we can get more clean energy built at the pace and scale that we need it to be to reach our climate needs, while also ensuring that the infrastructure is built in an engaged, equitable, and transparent way. In the last year, I've done a lot of research and case study work on community engagement and community benefits for clean energy in New England and across the US. And I'm excited to share some of those perspectives with you all today and also be part of this discussion.
Thanks, Natalie. Megan, can we turn it to you next, please?
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Renew Northeast for having me. And I'm excited to be here with my fellow panelists and Anxhela as well. I am the executive director of Self-Reliance Corporation, which is an energy nonprofit based in Katomet, Mass, which is part of Cape Cod. And I've been here since 2001. I have been working in the clean energy space since 1996. Been working on workforce training and really focused on how do we keep the tangible benefits of the clean energy sector in our local and regional economies. Been working in solar since the beginning, like 2001. I think we got our first grant from the Renewable Energy Trust Fund to give out rebates. I'm a systems thinker, so I like to think about and take action in terms of how do we engage a variety of stakeholders to be part of this transition. And I'm also a GWO, which is the Global Wind Organization basic safety instructor at Mass Maritime Academy, where I teach working in heights and sea survival. So I'd like to do sort of the back of the back office stuff and coming up with things, as well as actually engaging with folks. So thanks so much. Look forward to the discussion tonight.
Thank you, Megan. And please, Mike, can we turn it to you next?
Yes, thank you everybody for coming, everybody involved. I'm Mike Jacobs. I work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a nonprofit in Cambridge, headquartered in Cambridge. It's 50 years in the making. I started my career working at the Massachusetts state government for 6 years. That included 3 years of the Energy Facility Siting Board. That was in the 1990s. After that, I went to the private sector and worked in a couple of different renewable energy jobs, getting to the point of working in transmission and wind development with the title of Vice President for Transmission for a Boston-based wind developer company. And after that, honestly, I'd had enough of the private sector. I came to UCS to share what I'd learned about transmission and the grid in particular, and to do that in a way that would sort of enable more people to be engaged in transmission and energy choice debates. So this conversation today fits right in. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Let's kickstart our discussion. We have 50 minutes, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. To ground us first, can one of you explain what are community benefits frameworks and how are they currently being used in clean energy projects? Natalie, I think you wanted to take this one, so please feel free to dive in, and then whoever wants to add more after that, please continue.
Yeah, happy to. So community benefits frameworks are usually an arrangement where a developer agrees to provide benefits to a community, often in exchange for hosting infrastructure for a clean energy project. They can be used to mitigate project harms and enhance project benefits, and they can take a lot of different shapes. There's no really good set definition on how to describe these. Frameworks for this could take place or could take the form of a signed and negotiated agreement, such as a community benefit agreement or a host community agreement. They could also be a workforce agreement, like a project labor agreement or a community workforce agreement. All of these have acronyms that go along with them, making it a huge acronym soup. And they could also be voluntary initiatives as well that aren't formally negotiated. So it could just be a one-time payment to a community. It could be the ways in which the developer aligns the project to meet a community's long-term needs, building in their input into the design process, or helping to upgrade existing infrastructure in a community at the desire of the community. So it really falls under a broad umbrella. Sometimes they can be legally enforcing if they are a negotiated agreement, and other times if they're a plan, they more so just provide a framework for how the developer intends to approach engaging a community and what kinds of benefits the community can expect to see, even if it's tax revenue from a project. So it can be very confusing, and there are lots of different terms and ways to describe all of this, but we've seen them pop up for a range of projects. Usually for wind or solar projects, we've seen a community benefits agreement that's tied to it. where there might be some sort of financial compensation package in exchange for community's agreement to support the project or to grant approvals. There could also be an agreement for design modifications or other little niche things that pop up. So I'll pause there and see if Megan or Mike want to chime in as well.
So I would say about this, the agreement has to have two sides or more. So, local communities would strengthen their goals, strengthen their positions by having some planning or thought ahead of time about what they're trying to do in their community, because energy is already in your community. Everybody's got both a reliance on energy and some opportunity to produce. So thinking ahead at the town level before a developer shows up is a fine idea.
And I would say also, just to sort of follow up on that, is that having some organization around that, whether it's in the shape of a town supported energy committee or a climate action committee, that group of folks, it's really important to be together and sort of understand what the needs are and what the questions are, and be early to the table with these projects. I think that's really, really important.
I'd like us to expand more on the energy committee piece at a later time, but before we dive in, just to ground the audience, big picture thinking right now, with increased emphasis on community benefits, especially through the 2024 Climate Act, which is reshaping how renewable energy facilities are being permitted. Where have we seen successful collaboration, whether that's through community benefits agreements, community benefits plans, or other approaches?
Are we speaking about Massachusetts specifically? Because Block Island, if we want to look at offshore wind, Block Island is a great example. Getting power back to the grid. They had everything negotiated with the Consensus Building Institute as moderators, and I think that's one example that we could look at, certainly.
Yeah, I can speak to the offshore wind development again. There's an organization on Martha's Vineyard that worked out a series of relationships with one of the developers that included setting up a fund, essentially sort of a rotating loan fund, to use in the community for resilience and low-income bill payments. So as to sort of help the energy transition as the offshore wind developed, provide literally a little share of what the wealth of the offshore wind was creating in a public service. Literally the idea was solar and batteries for the fire stations and the water treatment plant. So it's really sort of tangible in that sense. But the Block Island story is really about infrastructure. Is a great example.
And jobs too, just to follow up on what Mike is talking about, the commitment to local jobs. And I think that we can go all the way back to the Cape Wind days when, there was the unions showed up and in force. And of course there wasn't any training yet. So, there's a lot of things that I think communities are not really sure what they can rightfully ask for while we're still in the early stages. And I learned a lot from that part of the Cape Wind stakeholder process that went on for many years. But I think thinking about jobs, and I'm a big advocate for cooperatively owned projects. We don't see a lot of that unless we look over across the pond to Denmark, but thinking outside the box in terms of how we want to have those tangible benefits come back to our community. I think that's really important for us to think about.
And yeah, speaking from outside of a New England perspective, although maybe there are instances of this I'm not aware of, I've seen some examples in other parts of the country where there are new approaches to community benefits that are more of a regional-based model, or people are really working to develop regional-based models, approaches for community benefits, where if a project impacts multiple communities, thinking about like a transmission line that passes through multiple communities, then how can we deliver benefits to each community along the path? It's a bit more tricky than when you're considering just one community. And there are a few examples of how I've seen this pop up. There's an organization in the San Joaquin Valley in California that's trying to develop a grassroots approach to this, where they're building a local nonprofit capacity to negotiate with developers for a range of solar projects that are going to come into their community, so that they can have kind of self-determined community benefits from that. And on the flip side, I've also seen this on the developer side as well. Also for a transmission line in Montana, North Dakota, very different context. But there, the developer has been very upfront and put a community investment plan in place from the start of the project, and is investing into the community through statewide foundations that are then bringing that money down locally to counties, and creating community advisory committees to determine how those funds are used within the community. And this is making, using existing networks, existing foundations that are run by communities to determine where the funds are going from these projects.
And then before moving to our next question, Megan, can you just elaborate a bit more on the Denmark model, just for audience members that might not be familiar with it?
Sure.
Great point.
Middelgrunden in Copenhagen Harbor is a cooperatively owned wind farm that it's like half owned by the utility and half owned by people like all of us. So, and all that power goes back into the city to serve households and businesses.
Great, thank you. For our next question, I'd like to focus on community engagement in a little bit more detail. So what does community engagement look like in practice? So how can developers move beyond a sort of checklist approach and move towards deeper, earlier engagement with communities?
I'll speak to that. I would say cultivating a culture within the development industry that it's not just a checklist. I think that is one surefire way to get people to feel really upset and have that whole, like, whatever it is, I'm against it kind of attitude. I think understanding that there needs to be some deep listening going on, that there needs to be it needs to be a back and forth. There really needs to be a dialogue and understanding of what are people's concerns, and really listen to communities. I think also, sort of on the flip side of that, though, as I sat on the Falmouth Energy Committee for many years, and we had a solar developer come to us and wanted to, it's like take a big piece of land, give it back, get it so that the town owned it, but they had a long-term lease. We were able to talk to them a lot about what our concerns were in terms of having community access still to these project, to the project, even though it's sort of dissected by a road. But, sledding hill if we still get snow, pollinator plantings, affordable housing, community shared solar, microgrid, really digging into the weeds on some of this stuff. I think that's really important, to be able to have a developer at the table who's willing to listen to that and not just say, no, we just wanted to check a box here and be on our merry way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think leaning into what the community is interested in from a project and what their concerns are is important. I think the developer might come in with a preconceived idea of like what the concerns might be or what the community wants, and it might not align with what they actually want. So having those earnest conversations is really important. Another thing I'll add is that first impressions really matter. I think often that is maybe underthought of, but really I've seen this in a few examples where once a developer contacts one person in the community, everyone in the community is going to know what's happening, and who you contact matters. So that's important. And also finding somebody who understands, who's on your engagement team as a developer, who understands the community that they're going into, is also very important. It could also mean finding somebody in the community who could be a local champion for you, or could help you to access the right people in the network, to initiate conversations with people. I think early on, just reaching out to as many people as you possibly can, and just saying, approaching them humbly as well, and not coming in with like a fully baked project, but opening it up to have some dialogue and some flexibility, and making sure it is a two-way street.
And then for our next question, can you all provide examples of where early engagement either prevented conflicts or delays later on in the permitting process?
Yeah. So I've been involved with a variety of wind development projects. I'm actually sort of both the community side and as a developer in the past. And the right. So the point I guess I'm really getting at is that not everybody understands the jargon, and the number of times things have to be said before people understand them is always underestimated. So this is a responsibility on both sides to both communicate clearly and listen. And the idea that before permitting gets really started, open houses where the developer literally says, we've got a space, we're going to offer snacks, and we want people to come talk to us, has sort of just lowered the, it's informal, right? So lowered the sort of tension about what kind of conversations have to be had. So I've seen that in upstate New York, and honestly, the ways some of the things worked on the earliest days on Martha's Vineyard, the conversation started even before there was a specific developer. Again, with the idea that there's sort of a local community organization that wanted to air some of the issues and find some of the points of conflict in advance. So the idea has been more formalized, but I think what we were thinking about had to do with the idea of what are the zones or priorities we'd want to see development pushed into, so that it doesn't happen places we don't want. And it created something of priorities to be able to communicate to the developer. And that's become sort of a best practice. I've heard it from transmission developers going to the communities and saying, tell me about all the things you don't want us to do. And we'll make a priority list, but it has to come from that conversation back and forth.
I would say, just to follow up on what you articulated, Mike, is that visioning is really important. And I think that's where the community as well as decision makers need to come together. And I know that there has, people feel overwhelmed, and it is really jargony and complex. But I think overall, having some visioning, investing in the time and really digging into what the visioning, what the community wants to see, like that whole process is essential. And I back to your point about Martha's Vineyard, right? That visioning sessions that took place over there of like, how far offshore do we want to have the wind farms? And so people felt like they were heard. And I think that's really, really important. And then, there was a whole bunch of stakeholder processes that took place, like, these are exclusion zones, we're not going to do anything in this space. And then it got into even into the metrics of how BOEM decides whether or not you're going to get a lease area that you're bidding on. So, I think that I think communities haven't maybe thought about that in terms of other types of projects, but I'm very myopic in terms of how I look at this, but I would encourage people to think about that, both on the developer side and I don't think there's really any harm in saying we need to have a visioning process, because it gets everybody hopefully to the table to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I echo that a lot or completely. And I also think like the thinking about energy in like land use planning as well is really important. A lot of communities have never considered how an energy infrastructure project might be show up in their community, or on what kind of land they would want it or where they would want it, and might be really unfamiliar with a lot of the technical specifics of what are noise limits that you would want on even a solar project or a wind project. What are the setbacks that you want? And it can be really confusing. And we've seen a lot of examples where, out of an abundance of caution, a community might accidentally put or intentionally put an ordinance in place that could be overly restrictive for an energy project, or make it even harder to build one. So I think there's also a role here for regional organizations and for the state governments and others to provide resources and information about like what are the guidelines and shaping local policies around clean energy projects, so that that's done proactively and considering how and where and if a community wants an energy project to be sited.
I guess just to follow up on that, though, is to remind community members, I mean, all of us, right, is that energy touches everything we do. And so an energy project, if in a visioning session, we can think about housing, wastewater treatment, water pumping, all of these different things, resilience, I think now, especially, it's not really cut and dry in terms of where the energy, is this power just going into the grid? And I think that goes sort of back to the community benefits, is empowering communities to feel like, hey, we'd like some of these benefits that are maybe ancillary to the project itself to stick within our boundaries. And that, again, we can't expect that developers to be like, we've come up with all of these things that you want. We really do have to be able to say, these are the things that we would like. So encourage that.
And then I've received this question a ton before, so I do want to pose it, and to build off a point that Natalie made earlier on this early engagement piece, but how can developers learn who to approach in a community? And maybe we can elaborate on what early engagement means to you all just before we shift to the next next discussion.
I think it kind of depends on the project. If it's a project that's looking towards private landowners for a lease, then likely they're probably going to want to approach those landowners first and the neighbors of the project first, and also go to the local government first. Talk to the people who are directly involved in the project at the closest level. But then once you've had those initial conversations, then it should be expanded to the broader community to make sure that everyone's aware of this and it hasn't caught anyone by surprise. If it's, some other projects that aren't working with multiple landowners, or that are sited on a government property or public property or something like that, go to the town first and then broadly engage the community. But also reach out to as many community organizations as you possibly can. Invite yourself to present at their meetings, or if you're a community organization, invite the developer to come and give a briefing. I think they would probably appreciate that opportunity. So I would say that. And then when it comes to what does early engagement mean, I think it also varies a little bit on the project. But really, I would say it's before the final plans are drawn up. I think there is such a thing as engagement that happens too early. And if a developer goes into a community and just has a broad idea but can't answer any specific questions about what will this look like, where will it be, how big is it, what can I expect the boundaries to look like, I don't think the community will probably feel like they have gotten their questions answered, or that they have a clear picture of what's happening. On the flip side, if they go in and say, we're building a project here, this is exactly how it's going to be, and it's polished and done, it needs to be somewhere in between. And I think my read is that would happen like around a year before permits are in place. But again, completely is different on the project and might look very differently.
Yeah, but this is a really valid question, because even after you start, there's not like one person that can talk for the town or can listen for the town. And the, the town needs to have, some kind of, um, thought process ahead of time. And we've talked about it as visioning, but the sort of, if nobody in the town's ever talked about their energy needs or even where their, emergency response plans are located, and it's all as a surprise to everybody, it's a little chaotic, and each person who walks in the room has to start the whole conversation over again. So the towns, and they vary, of course, in size and the number of people who sit on the same boards and so on, because you're dealing with a lot of volunteers. The sort of opportunity to have some, you said sort of energy committee, some conversations that the town's already started on some of these topics, and that gives people in the community an unofficial representative or a person that can do a little bit of traffic direction about, you got to make sure you talk to these folks, you got to talk to those folks. So there is on both sides some coherence to the communication.
Megan, if there's no comments from you, I'll turn to the next question. Okay, great. So Natalie mentioned local government support, but beyond that, what resources do communities themselves need to be able to engage in these processes? So what will help them come to the table prepared?
I mean, there's a lot, but this wouldn't be the first development, right? So you've already got, stormwater management plans for the town. And you've probably got a shopping list of things we'd like to have for improving our resilience in the town. So in a sense, there's sort of an assembling of things the town's already got. And in my mind, the sort of time of the volunteers or the staff professionals, depending upon the size of your town, to loop those things in and spread them out for the developer to understand. But I mean, the simplest thing of, we've got this natural resource, heritage resource that we've always wanted to elevate. And so can we get the developer, A, to stay away from it, and B, is there something that ties in here that we can elevate with their help? That kind of, priorities, shopping list, budget needs, all that's really useful to have at the table to bring it along.
I think the other thing is understanding that there are other organizations outside of your municipality that you can reach out and talk to and find out how did you develop this community benefit agreement, or how did you guys handle a similar thing? And oftentimes people are super happy to talk and offer, oh, you should talk to so-and-so about this. This organization over here, they've done a bunch of these community benefit agreements, or people are looking online and they can't find the level of detail that they want. And you really need to have some of those more granular conversations with people in the know. And I think that that's, living in this digital world, you can find people that are working on stuff or have been involved in these things in the past that can share information. And I think that's important, building those relationships and listening to experiences of other communities that have been successful in getting their needs met. I think that's really key.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I also think even going to see what it might look like in another community in person can be really informative. So either field tripping yourself or taking a small group with you and having conversations with the people who have lived with this infrastructure near them and seeing what their experience has been like through, the entire project cycle so far. And now that it's up and running is really important. I think also there's a role for higher level roles of government to provide technical assistance, staffing and capacity or resources, either for crafting local policies or planning or like convening planning processes or providing assistance in that way, or even providing financial resources for local communities to proactively develop plans, to hire other consultants or experts who might be able to advise them on which way to go, and also at the state level creating point people or a liaison for when that project is proposed, that they can go to directly if it's running through a state permitting process as well.
Great, thank you everyone. And just a reminder to the audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A feature. I'd like us now to elaborate on the energy committee point that was raised earlier. How can a town benefit from having an energy committee, and what kind of initiatives can these committees pursue to advance some of these clean energy, climate resilience, and community benefit goals?
So Megan, you said you serve on a town committee. I've done as well.
Yeah.
Green Communities Act, right? We're in Massachusetts. Which is just, I mean, that's sort of the municipality's goals for reduction in energy use and emissions. But what we've done in some of these situations is sort of after the town's needs are met, if it's a small town, there's a limited number of buildings, does the town energy committee support the residents adopting utility programs for energy conservation, which, you know, help meet our energy goals and lower people's bills? You know, we can go on. Let me pause.
No, I think I concur. I will say, like, we started our committee in 2001. Back then we joined ICLEI and used their software, did our energy benchmarking back in like 2002, tried to get other communities on board. It was a little hard. I think Barnstable was the other community that joined in. We had Tufts interns doing the, you know, slogging through finding energy bills. But, you know, we then had both municipal and community combined in one climate protection action plan put together. And that, you know, we've tried to keep that updated, which I think it's a little different than Green Communities, right? Which is solely looking at your municipal energy consumption. And I think there are other communities that have climate resilience committees and coastal communities, right, are looking at some different things. But I think it's really important that those committees don't get siloed and that there is conversation around that. I mean, we are super lucky in our region because we have the Cape Light Compact. And so we can have, you know, we have liaisons to the compact board. Every community has that, but we have, you know, fabulous staff that can show up and, you know, give discussions, you know, they'll give talks around what the programs are and, you know, help peel away some of the mystery around, you know, what are heat pumps and just, you know, how do I as a resident or a small business take advantage of the programs through the Mass Save program? I think that's also a role that an energy committee can play, is really helping be that conduit between the end user and people who are like, they are curious but overwhelmed.
Yeah, I'm not even sure exactly what the question was here, but one of the things that's gone on Martha's Vineyard on the regional level, because there's this Martha's Vineyard Commission, so it's, you know, 6 towns, but they have a central agency that's been in conversations with the local utility, with Eversource, about the electrification and solar that people want for their own homes and the impacts that has on the utilities planning for infrastructure. So in that sense, all the development was grassroots and still ran into infrastructure bottlenecks. So there's really, you know, it takes a village kind of story here. It's definitely a team effort because partly the topics are broad, but then you find we need several heads and several disciplines to think about this.
Great. Natalie, if you have nothing else, nothing to add there, great. Okay, we can move on to the next topic. So this was also briefly mentioned before, so I want to give you all a chance to elaborate a little bit more, but projects can involve trade-offs, whether that's around land use or environmental impacts. And how do you approach these trade-offs honestly with communities while keeping projects moving forward?
Can we also add workforce to that? Because I think that's a really key piece here that, and I can address that because I think that for Vineyard Wind 1, the public labor agreement, that was that was amazing, right? It's like, we're making a commitment, we're going to employ X number of people. And it got down into the weeds in terms of how many women and, different levels of detail in terms of what they wanted to see. And they've exceeded those goals. We had to have training, right? And I have seen a lot of those people come through my classes at Mass Maritime Academy. And it's been really interesting to see how that public labor agreement has helped transform the way people think about working on energy projects and what that means and how they can be part of the clean energy industry, even, from a union perspective, where they're like, never thought that they would be working on an offshore wind project. And so I think that, and again, I don't mean to hijack the question, but to me, that's how I see it, is like, there's the workforce piece. Otherwise, we don't really have the expertise in the offshore wind space, right? Those jobs would be lost, and the dollars associated with them would leave our local communities and our regional economies. I think procurement is also super important when we're talking about terrestrial projects, and thinking about, what do we as communities want? Do we want to put in something, make a request, even if it's happening on private land, of using local businesses, because that's a way to keep those tangible benefits within our local economies. Sorry for hijacking your question.
But let me offer because part of this question is sort of, recognize there are physical impacts, visual impacts. So the things that come to my mind, because I've dealt with sort of the linear side of some of these things, the roads that the equipment is going to need for building the project, or the roads that the project's going to be buried in. I can think of a couple of examples where the result after the deal was, quite literally, while we've got our equipment out there, we're going to satisfy some town goals for that corridor, whether it's an improvement in the roadbed, some of these transmission lines coming into the Cape from offshore involved improving the water systems that they were going to be interacting with. And it was a joint effort with the towns, because they had a backlog for some of that infrastructure work. And it was really an economies of scale, with the developers saying, I got to rip up that road, or my trucks are going to rip up that road inadvertently. How should we make that better when we're done meeting your goals? So it reduced the amount of construction time, and certainly the economics of do this once rather than do it twice.
Definitely. And I would also say, I feel like it's important to be really transparent with what both the expected impacts are going to be and what the expected benefits are going to be. I think we also need to make sure we're not over-promising what the benefits from a project will be, unless we can ensure that they are delivered, and or make sure it's a contract that they're obligated to as well. So I think we or developers, or anyone, shouldn't make these projects look too shiny if they aren't sure that they can follow up on delivering all the benefits. So I think Honesty, transparency is really important, and discussing, not trying to hide, what the impact will be by talking about how great the project will be. I think people will understand that they're not getting, or have a sense that they're not getting the full picture, and would appreciate having the full picture and having a conversation of what mitigation efforts could take place, or what alternatives could be built into the project as well to help mitigate some of those impacts, or plan proactively for what it will be. I had something else I was going to say that Mike inspired, and now I cannot remember it.
Road building.
That's a great point, Natalie. You actually led me perfectly into my next question, and I do see a Q&A from the audience that we will get to, but can you elaborate on that point, please, as to how developers can ensure that benefits promised, either in a community benefits plan or community benefits agreement, are actually delivered to the community?
Establishing a negotiated contract up front where they're obligated or legally obligated to deliver those funds is really important, and also establishing benchmarks for when, or accountability measures as well, of when the community could come back and say, in a few years or something, let's check back in and see where we're at and how much progress has been made. I think establishing that up front is really important. And then creating opportunities to rediscuss things as well, I think is another opportunity there. For benefit plans, there's less certainty involved because it is a plan. But I think as long as you can establish trust and have honest, transparent conversations, I think that's really important. But I think we should be looking for ways to ensure that there's accountability for benefits.
Great, and now to the question posed in the Q&A. So are there examples of community engagement for multi-community developments? So whether a developer is negotiating with various towns or cities, if energy infrastructure is crossing through multiple areas, example, transmission line.
I have two that come to mind. One is what I mentioned earlier. It's a project that hasn't started construction yet. It's the one I mentioned in North Dakota and Montana, the North Plains Connector Line. It's still getting all of its landowner approvals, but what they've done is developed a community investment plan or program, and they're working or partnering with the State Foundation for Montana and the State Foundation for North Dakota, who have local chapters in each county where they're delivering, I believe it's 3.9 million over 3 years. And this is before the project is even built. And if the project doesn't get built, the money is still going to be there. So it's demonstrating their commitment to the community up front. And then within each county, they're setting up a community advisory committee who over the 3 years will get pots of money, accept applications from residents on how that money should be used within the community. The local advisory committee will make a decision and disperse the funds accordingly. The developer, I think, has a seat on these advisory committees, but they're not the decision maker. It's really put into the hands of the committees. It works really well under this framework for these two states because they're pretty rural, sparsely populated states, and especially where this transmission line is running through, it's very sparsely populated. And so the state foundations really play a significant role in these states. The structure that you would use for transmission line going through a more densely populated area could be different. In that case, it might, you might look to local community foundations that are set up in each area, or find, an agreement with each of the, larger counties that are along the route or something like that. The other example I'll bring up is it's the results of a settlement agreement. It was a proactive settlement agreement for a transmission line in Washington that was developed like over 10 years ago. But in this case, it's the Bonneville Power Administration, which is actually a federally managed transmission developer, had a settlement agreement with a local community organization to establish a mitigation fund. And in this case, the fund, the BPA administered where the funds were used, but the community organization accepted applications from either others in the community, local governments, or other community organizations of what mitigation projects could be taken on. It resulted in purchasing properties that would be put into conservation easements. So that's another example. It was meant to benefit the broader community. There was a little bit of contention around whether or not this community organization was the right one to receive the funds and choose where the money was going. So I think that's also really important, is figuring out who the right entity is to actually sign these agreements and be responsible for managing funds. You want to make sure it's really benefiting the people who are most impacted by the infrastructure, and making sure that a lot of people have a say in how it's being used as well. So hopefully those are two helpful examples.
Great examples. Thank you. Mike, Megan, do you want to elaborate, or I can move us? We have time for a few more questions. Okay, great. This one, before I get to my final questions, it'd be great if we can elaborate on this just a bit more. But for communities that may be skeptical of clean energy projects, what strategies have worked to build trust? If we could just hone in on that point a little bit more, I think that would be great for our audience.
Well, I was taught early on, people listen to the radio station, what's in it for me, WINF. Everything can be reduced down to dollars in this culture we have. So if they don't believe in clean energy, they still believe in tax revenue. To be blunt and simplify.
Sorry, the question was how, can you repeat the question?
So what strategies have worked to build trust? And I'm looking just more on how we can kind of elaborate on this point for communities that may are skeptical of clean energy projects. So
I think inclusion and planning processes and decision-making processes before a single project, or before a project is proposed, would be ideal. That's not always going to be the case, because we are building projects every day, which is a good thing. But I think early discussions, the visioning that we talked about earlier, I think is really important when it comes to a specific project. It's really relationship based when it comes down to it. I think having open conversations, just, recognizing that you're going into a community, you're going into someone's home, and asking for permission to build something there with their support, ideally. So I think just being honest, giving the data, giving the information, being honest about what the project can change, what you can't change about the project, being honest about what the benefits are and what the impacts are going to be. I think kind of laying it out on the table, and that will help establish, I think. I've heard an example from a wind developer who basically said they were able to get somebody to allow a turbine to be sited on their property after they were initially really reluctant, because they said that they approached them and were very humble and gave them all the information, and they didn't feel like they were being forced into a decision. They felt like they were giving them all the facts, and they were allowed to make that decision and explore it for themselves. So I think, yeah, I'll leave it there.
And then looking ahead, it would be great to hear a priority that you'd like to see either Massachusetts or the New England region get right in the next 5 years when it comes to community benefits and clean energy development. So just for a fast lightning round, as we only have a few minutes to wrap up here.
So let me make a plug, for economic opportunity for the future, that certainly employing or bringing wealth through this investment into the community, the deal.
I concur.
Yeah, I would say make sure that people feel like there's a real economic opportunity, and it's not just a check the box exercise that's a requirement, and that there's like a substantial weight behind what these benefits conversations are.
Great, thank you. And if panelists, if there are any other points that you want to raise on topics I may not have addressed yet, I think we have a minute or two left, so please feel free to take that, and then we'll get to closing remarks.
So I would just say you're going to use energy in your community and development of some form. So you might as well think, what do you want? What's your priority?
I would just tag on to that, thinking about resilience, even if the developer is not necessarily pitching resilience, that should be part of how, as communities, we are thinking about this stuff, is that, all right, you're building this stuff, that is a tangible benefit that we can have that serves the community and our emergency, whether it's emergency functions, whatever. Again, I think it's up to communities to plan and think about this stuff, but be bold.
I agree. Nothing further from me.
Well, you've all been fantastic and great with your timing, and thank you really to all the panelists for your insights. These examples really highlight how community engagement can make projects stronger. Many thanks also to audience members for spending your Thursday evening with us. And now I'd like to turn it to Nathan just for closing remarks.
Thank you, Anxhela. And once again, thank you to our amazing panelists for joining us this evening in this engaging conversation. Before we conclude this evening, mark your calendars. Renew has 3 more events on the ledger for the year. So keep an eye out on your email for information regarding our upcoming event on October 22nd. Details and registration will be available soon. Again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Before we end tonight, please take a brief survey and share your thoughts about tonight's discussion. Also share with us other topics or speakers you would be interested in hearing from. We will leave the QR code up for a couple of minutes. Thank you again for joining and have a wonderful evening.